Thank you everyone for joining us today. We're AccessAble. We are the UK's leading provider of detailed disabled access information. Today's session will focus on supporting people with hidden disability. We'll just give it a minute or so for the last few people to join.
Hello, my name is Hannah Riley.
Hi there. We are just asking everybody who isn't a webinar panelist to please mute their microphones.
Yeah, I might have to leave if my doorbell ring. That's what I wanted to tell you.
No problem at all. Thank you for letting me know.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. That's it. I'm in. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate your help.
Okay. Thank you for everyone for joining us today. As a recap, today's session will focus on supporting people with hidden disability. A quick mention on housekeeping. The session is being recorded. If you are not a webinar panelist, please mute your microphone. Panelists, please mute their microphones when they're not speaking. And any attendees, audience members, if you have questions or comments throughout the session, please feel free to use the chat function in Teams. We will do our best to bring these out throughout the session, and we will also have some time for a short Q&A at the end. A note for anybody who would like to use captions for today's sessions, Teams does provide live captioning, and to turn that on, if you press the more options or three dots at the top of your screen and then click turn on live captions, you'll have access to the live caption facility. My name's Carrie-Anne Lively. I'm Head of Marketing at AccessAble, and I'll be leading today's session. And I'm now going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. So Natalie, we'll come to you first. Please introduce yourself, your lived experience relating to today's session and the work that you do.
Hi, I'm Natalie. I have basically been disabled since I was a baby. I was diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis at 15 months, so I've never known anybody different from that. I've also got Crohn's disease, and because of that I had an ileostomy 5.5 years ago now. So that's something else I have to deal with. I've also got a condition with my eyes, which was caused by the rheumatoid arthritis, and that can cause problems with my vision. And actually, I'm having surgery next week as part of that. I write a blog called The Spoonie Mummy, where I talk about life and parenting with chronic illness. I try and sort of chart the highs and the lows and show that just because you're disabled doesn't mean that your life is over. It can still be happy and it can still be really fulfilling. I'm currently studying at university, psychology based mostly, with hopes of becoming a psychotherapist and supporting people with disabilities and ostomies with their mental health, which I think is something that's severely underdone. With regards to sort of lived experience, I do occasionally have to use walking aids, although because the arthritis is also in my hands, wrists and elbows, sort of using a stick isn't always the best thing for me. So sometimes I use it if my knees are playing up, but sometimes I don't. I've used crutches, I've had to use wheelchairs on occasion. I use disabled toilets and disabled parking. Disabled toilet, obviously, especially with my ostomy, but also with my arthritis. And yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you, Natalie. Next, we'll come on to Lydia. Lydia, please introduce yourself.
Hi, right, I'm going to assume for sake of argument people can hear me. I'm not used to this technology, so apologies in advance. my name's Lydia, obviously. By trade, I'm a freelance journalist and copywriter, so my work has appeared in places such as The Independent, Refinery 29, Reader's Digest, The Metro. Generally speaking, I cover kind of like disability and social justice issues. So it could be, for example, in terms of like appropriate adults and in police stations with disabled individuals. That's something I'm working on right now. In terms of my lived experience, I am on the autistic spectrum. So I was diagnosed, I'm just trying to work this out, around 6 years ago. However, I have always been autistic. I've not known any different. I am also currently waiting on a diagnosis for dyscalculia, which is it's dyslexia but with numbers. When in terms of things that I use, for example, you might see the sunflower lanyards, which indicate a hidden disability, such as when you go into Sainsbury's or into banks such as Halifax. I'm just trying to give examples just so people can, you know, recognize them. I do use aids in terms of like getting around and that kind of thing. However, that seems to vaguely shock people because I can talk at times, which is really interesting, and we'll be talking about that a little bit more later on. And I also just want to apologise. I have the horrible cough that's going around, so I will be muting myself strategically to not be annoying.
Thank you, Lydia. And lastly, Pippa, please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Pippa. I'm based up north in sunny Yorkshire, not so sunny today. By trade, I am a writer, a blogger and a speaker, and I also work in communications consultancy, mostly in the charity sector. Most of my interest is around inclusive education and employment, and a lot of that came out of my own experiences. I acquired my chronic illness as a teenager. I experienced a lot of barriers in even getting that initial diagnosis due to the fact that my condition is mostly invisible / less visible. My condition is something called ME. It's a neurological condition and it is known by a concept that is developing at the minute called an energy limiting chronic illness. All kinds of fun challenges that come with that, all the more so given that my condition is a lot of the time less visible, although like the other two, I do use mobility aids on occasion, and there are also unique challenges that come with being somebody who uses mobility aids and simultaneously has a less visible condition, which perhaps we might touch on later as well. And I'm looking forward to diving into that. So thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Pippa, and thanks to everyone. We're really delighted to have you here today and to be able to learn from your experiences. Just as a very quick introduction to the session for our audience, I've included some key statistics on this slide which show why it's so important to think about how you support people with hidden disability. So 1 in 5 people in the UK are disabled, and around 80% have an invisible disability. That is, you know, that means that the majority of disabled people in the UK will have impairments or conditions that you would not be able to see, and that's why it's really important not to make assumptions and to treat everybody as an individual. We will now begin the panel discussion where you'll get insight into each of our panelists' lived experience. So our first questions here really focus on assumptions and language. So panelists, we'd like to know from you what assumptions you feel people make when it comes to invisible disability, what language you're most comfortable using, and what language you are most comfortable with other people to use when speaking about invisible disability. So panelists, anybody ready to answer this question first? Natalie, we'll go to you first. Thank you.
So I class myself as disabled. Obviously, I've had rheumatoid arthritis for as long as I remember, which causes a lot of issues with mobility. So that's always been the case. But I do know since being diagnosed with Crohn's and having the ileostomy and sort of being involved in that world, I work with a charity that supports people with ileostomies. I know a lot of those people that don't have sort of another illness alongside that struggle with the word disability because they don't see themselves as disabled. I think the connotation is that it's something to do with your mobility, and obviously they've got something that you can't see, whether it be Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, it's Crohn's that caused mine, ileostomy, or whether they've had an ileostomy due to cancer or anything else. So it is tricky. I think a lot of those people sort of describe themselves as chronically ill rather than disabled. And so, like I say, I'm more than happy with disabled. I feel a bit icky about differently abled, but then I think it's everybody's individual choice as to what they sort of like to describe themselves as. Assumption wise, I am young, I like to wear makeup, I like to dress up when I go out, so a lot of people obviously assume that I'm absolutely fine, and don't understand why I'm using disabled toilets or disabled parking and things like that. I've had people tut in, have had people actually get managers of a venue I was at, because they saw me going to the disabled toilet with my 2 children. They were waiting to go in there with their partner, and they actually called a manager to come and sort of get me out, which was awful because I was in a Crohn's flare at the time, obviously on the toilet. I had severe diarrhea, and I was having the door knocked on by this manager asking if I was okay and what I was doing in there. So I think it's all about just not assuming anything just from the look of somebody. I've got 2 children as well, so to all intents and purposes I look like I'm carrying about as normal, but there's a lot of stuff sort of going on that you don't know about.
Thank you, Natalie. And I think it's a really important point to bring out of your answer in terms of language, that, you know, there is generally acceptable language and terminology, but that everybody will have their own personal preferences on what language they would prefer themselves to use when they're describing themselves, and you know, that's fine. It's fine for everybody to have their own preferences, but you know, there are more generally accepted terms, which is what we'll cover in the discussion today. And then Pippa, your thoughts on language and on assumptions, please.
Yeah, I thought Natalie put that really well, and I could relate to a lot of what she said there. Disability is a term I've become more comfortable using. I think quite an interesting point to make, and what seems to be quite common among people with invisible and less visible illnesses, which is the term I personally sometimes use as well, is that a lot of the time, a lot of us have experienced quite a significant amount of gaslighting in terms of accessing support, whether that's medical support or social support. So a lot of the time we somehow begin to see ourselves as less entitled to accessing the support that we should be entitled to, which can add an extra layer of complexity to the whole situation. And because of that, I think it can take quite a lot of time and acceptance before you really begin to learn how to advocate for your needs and to see yourself as truly belonging to the disability community. And I think that's something that as a society we need to be quite mindful of, and making sure that people with invisible and less visible conditions are a part of this movement towards inclusion as well. But yeah, for me, disability, disabled, absolutely fine, invisible, less visible. And then I briefly mentioned this earlier, but a term that's cropping up more and more, and I think holds particular relevance to invisible disability, is this term energy limiting condition. Because as somebody with a chronic illness, we do have quite unique challenges that come with that. And as of yet, there hasn't always been a label, so to speak, that encompasses that. So that is an emerging term, and there's a lot of work being done around that and how that fits into the social model of disability as well. So it's an interesting time. I think that's me in a nutshell for this one.
That's excellent. Thank you for that, Pippa. Really insightful. I'm going to move straight on to our next question, if everybody is happy. And I think this focuses on the support that each of our participants may or may not need given their lived experience with hidden disability, and any aids or equipment that you guys might use that you find helpful, and just more information about the reality. What is the reality of living and working with the condition that you have? So participants, Lydia, we'll come to you first. Thank you.
Okay, so in terms of this question is kind of really interesting to me, simply because so I have only just applied and gotten personal independence payment, for example. So just to pick up on the point about gaslighting earlier, in terms of the language, I prefer to call myself disabled, but I am autistic and it's defined as a disability in terms of the Equality Act. But it was because, and this links to this question, it was because of the way in which that was presented in the kind of, oh, you're so inspirational, you have a superpower, that I wasn't given support for such a long time. Despite the fact that I'm 22, I have 22 years of experience being autistic. So in terms of what are the realities of living and working, that has only it's begun to change for me recently because of this support that I have only just been given. As a journalist, I have found newsrooms are frankly discriminatory to autistic individuals. Added to this, in terms of kind of like getting around and going to places, has been frankly awful at the best of times. I have to rely on public transport because it's unlikely I will be able to drive. In terms of support, it would be, because I'm hypersensitive to noise, it would be wonderful if basic adaptations were normalized. So I choose to be freelance just because my needs were not being met. So it would have been wonderful, for example, if had I been in a newsroom, things like headphones being acceptable, and yet that wasn't. In terms of kind of like interview stages, for example, but then also like being what's the word? In terms of getting around as well, rather than just there's this idea that you can just do it, but not everyone can do. Not everyone can get around in the same way that is apparently normal. By aids and equipment, I have only just started to acquire this simply because I now can fund it. So I have various things like the sunflower lanyard, I have rail cards, I have the things to support my feet. That means that my spatial awareness issues won't play up so much. I think that answers the question. You're on mute, Carrie Ann.
Thank you, Lydia. That's really helpful, and I just think that your point on language as well is really worth underlining. Where this, there is a tendency to call people with certain impairment groups superheroes or superhumans, and sometimes that language can detract away from making sure that person's needs are then met.
If I can say, I was denied personal independence payment for that reason, right? Just like I need support, and because apparently you're inspirational, you don't get it. Just as an example.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Lydia. Other panelists, have you got any points to share on this one? Pippa, we'll come to you next, and then we'll go to Natalie.
Yeah, this one resonates quite a lot for me because I do have this interest in inclusive employment, and a lot of people with invisible disabilities, like Lydia said, aren't always best served in what we see as traditional workplaces. I think as well, when you have a fluctuating condition like a chronic illness, the aids and equipment, and also to an extent the support you need on a daily basis, can change. And a lot of what I call the disability admin, so to speak, comes with doing that work and trying to figure out in any given situation how accessible your environment is going to be, what needs you're going to have to be proactive in accommodating that day. And I think as an example, so I am an ambulatory wheelchair user, and that means I use a wheelchair on some days and not other days. There was an occasion where I used the train station, and because I wasn't using my own wheelchair on that day, I booked assistance. So I booked for the station wheelchair, to collect me off the train and to take me to the entrance, because it was a big train station and it was further than I could reasonably walk. And when I got off the train, the person who was supposed to have the wheelchair stopped and asked me if I was really disabled before they went and got the wheelchair. So I actually had to sit on the dirty train station floor because my needs weren't taken at face value. And that's not an uncommon experience. And I think that highlights really, and this wasn't all that long ago either. So I think when it comes to thinking about the support somebody needs, I think the most essential thing is that regardless of whether you can or cannot see somebody's impairment with your own eyes, it's of utmost importance to take what they're telling you at face value and not to question it, because at the end of the day, what reason would the individual have for not being truthful about that? So yeah, and there are many invisible I mean, the thing with invisible disabilities is that many of the challenges and accommodations are also invisible as well. And this is a bit of a cheeky plug, but I work for a really lovely charity called Astrid, who match talented people with chronic illnesses with inclusive employment opportunities, and always up for a chat about inclusive employment. And we're happy to help any organisations who might be interested in that, because goodness knows there's a lot of work we need to do in the area, but we're working on it.
Thank you, Pippa. I think what I'd like to bring out of Pippa's answer, you know, that image of you sitting on that dirty train station floor is very emotive to me, and what that says to me is that reasonable adjustments for anybody with any kind of condition, visible, less visible, not visible, should be met. And people should be able to ask businesses, venues, organisations to make adjustments without having to declare the exact nature of their condition, because it is simply that we need the services to be accessible, and not that we need to go into our medical history to request that. So thank you. Natalie, I'm going to come on to you last for this section. Any thoughts that you've got around the reality of your condition, what support you need, and any aids or equipment that you use?
So support-wise, I was sort of thinking about things like the sunflower lanyard, which have become really popular now. We actually carry a can't wait card, it's called. It's to use a toilet if you're out and about and there isn't maybe a public toilet. Sometimes in shops and things they don't have an actual public toilet, but you can sort of flash this card and it's sort of explaining that you've got this invisible illness, you need to use the toilet like there and then, because sometimes it is literally like I need to use the toilet now. And sort of getting awareness out there about things like that employees might be shown and how they can act on that, because often it's not acted upon. They just say they don't know what it is. Oh, you can't use the toilet. Oh, we can't help you. So sort of just spreading more awareness of things like that are out there to help people like us. And also with the employee thing, obviously I'm not working at the minute. I had my second big surgery just back in June. But I think one big thing is the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us how possible it is to work more from home. And it's something that sort of, for me, going back into employment soon would be, I'm not the type of person that would choose to work from home all the time if I could help it. But obviously, depending on how I'm feeling on a day-to-day basis, that may be the need. But I think it's just shown people that this is possible and given people like me hope going back into employment with a disability, with a condition that fluctuates, with something that I need to attend hospital appointments for. Sometimes I'm troubled by fatigue to the point where you couldn't pay me to keep my eyes open. And I think that's shown a lot of people that this could happen for us.
Thank you, Natalie. Again, just really, really insightful, and particularly as somebody who has just recently undergone those medical procedures that you described, you know, I imagine that your needs are sort of at the very forefront of your mind, your needs based on recovery from surgery, etc. So it's really useful to hear about that. Thank you. I'm going to move on to our next slide. And I think that what we want to focus on here is how, what important factors should be looked at in terms of improving accessibility and raising awareness of invisible disability. You will all, and you have brought out in answers previously, how it has felt when your needs have been misunderstood. But if there is anything additional that you'd like to cover on that, that would be great to hear about. And we do, the audience here are all here because they'd really like to know how businesses can better support people with invisible disability. So if you could think about those 3 points first of all, and then we will come on to the last question following that. So panelists, anybody ready with an answer? Lydia, let's go to you first. Thank you. Oh, Lydia, I'm sorry, I think you're on mute.
Sorry.
There you go.
Sorry
Oh,
about,
yeah,
sorry about that.
there you go.
Issue. Okay, so I have an example for this. In terms of important factors, I think that at a very base level, we need to begin very simply with the words and the choosing and the language, in the sense of how we treat and communicate and respect other individuals, because you can then everything starts with words and you build up from that. So as an example, in March of last year, I was flying to the States, and that this was literally as COVID-19 came to the US, and I very nearly ended up getting trapped in the States for this reason, because all the travel and all that sort of thing, it all shut down. Now, the thing about this is, that was the first time I had flown by myself, and I had the sunflower lanyard. And it really struck me because the airline and the airport I went through, they told me to go to the special reservations desk. And so me being me, just went up and said, "Hi, I'm autistic. I was told to come here and ask about reservations you may have." Within seconds, as soon as I said that, the woman behind the counter turned to my mum, who was behind me, having automatically assumed that this was my carer, and gone, "So, what needs does your daughter have, and how can we help her?" She talked through me, and that is something that is very common, and that in virtually every setting that I've gone to, be it a shop, be it a hospital, be it anywhere, that happens regularly. That kind of thing needs to stop happening, because we are the disabled person. My mum doesn't know me. She's not in my body. And credit to her, she turned around and said, "Why don't you ask Lydia? Like, she is there in front of you. Just ask her." So when that kind of thing happens, it is incredibly frustrating. So to be told that you have a problem with communication all the time, diagnostically, because you are autistic, and then to have people deliberately miscommunicate about your needs when you are communicating perfectly well, it is so infuriating. I cannot describe it, because I do not have the words for it. It is the bane of my existence. In order to support us better, I think that needs to be the starting block. We also need to talk about how the sunflower lanyard is not a mask exemption lanyard. It's to indicate an invisible disability. It's not for people to hijack to say, "I just won't wear a mask because I don't believe COVID-19 is a thing." That has really screwed me up. I can't go to places now because they don't think I'm autistic.
Thank you, Lydia. We will discuss more about the lanyard following, but absolutely agree with your points there that it is frustrating that something that has been designed as a tool to support people with invisible disability has almost been sort of co-opted or taken over, and seems to have really lost its meaning in some way. So panelists, any other thoughts on this one? Pippa, you've got your hand up, so we'll come to you next. Thank you.
Yeah, I just thought I would add, I really think I've been doing this invisible something for many, many years now. And I think it's really obvious when you're interacting with people from different businesses and organisations. I think it's immediately obvious when, one, somebody's had disability awareness training, and two, when that disability awareness training has included invisible disabilities. And it's been really interesting to see how it's evolved over the years, because if somebody has had that training and you approach them with your access needs or to ask a question, they won't blink an eyelid. Whereas if somebody doesn't have that insider knowledge and that awareness, you can still see them kind of give you that look up and down that I'm sure many people with invisible illnesses know so well. You can see them trying to figure out what your disability is. So I think there is a really profound difference, and that is something that is perceived by people with invisible disabilities. And then I suppose the other point really is, I would love to see people with lived experience of invisible disabilities more central in just the organisation and planning of events, different processes within businesses. I think having that lived experience means that it's a lot easier for any potential barriers to be spotted, and people can often add really valuable comments and insight that can make processes more accessible, especially because invisible disabilities, although awareness and knowledge is slowly increasing, I do feel we still have a long way to go in fully understanding and appreciating the diversity even within that element of disability. So I think you can never underestimate the power of people's lived experiences. Always be considering how you can improve your knowledge, but listen to lived experiences as well.
Absolutely, 100% agree with that comment, Pippa. I think, you know, throughout all of the work that we do at AccessAble and throughout the work that you're seeing us doing this webinar today, we involve amazingly talented and insightful disabled people like Pippa, Lydia and Natalie, and very much nothing about us without us. Natalie, your thoughts on these questions, please.
Well, I think Pippa just covered a couple of points that I sort of wanted to mention about getting people who have disabilities and especially invisible illnesses involved in training. It is really, really noticeable when you go into somewhere and ask a question whether those employees have had training in any sort of disability friendly manner or anything like that. Also, I just wanted to add about the how does it make you feel thing, and it can be really frustrating, and I get that, but it can also be really demoralizing, really upsetting. Often when you plan to go out somewhere or do something, it's taken a lot to sort of get there, and you may not be able to plan anything the day before and the day after at least to sort of have your recovery. So to go out and then face questions about the validity of what you're telling somebody or asking somebody to help with, it can be really gutting and really, really sort of affect you mentally.
Thank you, Natalie. I'm also just wondering if, from your experience, Natalie, it is worth mentioning something about the businesses that provide, or businesses in your experience that provide stoma-friendly toilets, from your experience of an ileostomy, and what that is and what a difference it makes.
It's massive. Obviously, going out and about, there aren't, to be honest, many out there. They are getting better. But going to a toilet that has it's little things like somewhere to hang your clothes up that are clean and dry, so you're not having to put them on a dirty toilet floor, having a sort of shelving area that you can use to put your equipment out. If I've had a bag leak when I'm out, it's the worst thing ever. It's obviously output is feces. It can be on your clothes, it can be everywhere, and so in itself that is just awful. But then to go to a toilet where you haven't got those sorts of facilities, just simple little things that can help get your bag changed, get your clothes changed if you need to change those as well, it makes a huge difference just to sort of make you feel that a little bit better and back in control, and being able to get your bag change done more efficiently and cleaner and things like that.
Thank you, Natalie, that's really helpful. I'm now going to ask you all for your thoughts on the final question on this slide, which is how important is having detailed and accurate and up-to-date accessibility information for you, with the understanding that that is the kind of information that AccessAble provides, and that based on a lot of what you've talked about today, for example, stoma-friendly toilets, venues with sunflower lanyards, etc., you know, that's the sort of information that we can bring out in our access guides. So who would like to go first on this question, panelists? Lydia, let's come to you first.
I think this is a bit of a no-brainer, to be honest. It's very important, and quite often as well, these are the only venues that I would go into. I'm not going to go somewhere that is inaccessible to me. Also, I'm not saying this also just because of my own viewpoint. It's a lot of my friends also have a disability as well, so they are going to be accommodated for by default because that is what we do. It's also, I think it's also about that having the information and having it as up to date as possible. It's empowering in the sense that it can be used to negate potential symptoms and hallmarks for various individuals. So just as an example, if I was to go to a train station or to a restaurant, having the train station information needs to be up to date. Where I live in Sussex, it's very often not, due to Southern Rail, and I really hate using it because that very often results in a meltdown. Having a different menu in a restaurant, and kind of like if it hasn't got like the accessible things on it, for me personally, that's deal breaker. Won't be going there.
Thank you, Lydia. Anybody else happy to give their thoughts on accessibility information? Natalie, we'll come to you next, and then we'll go to Pippa. Thank you.
Yeah, so I was just going to say about the website thing. Often websites of individual businesses and places are so out of date, and that's why AccessAble is so handy. I've mentioned I've got 2 boys, and sort of planning days out with them, especially if it's going to be sort of an all-day thing, I have to take so much more into account for my needs personally. And so having the sort of that information at your fingertips to be able to plan days out with them, knowing that should I have a bag leak, I've got a stoma-friendly toilet where I can go and change my bag really easily. Obviously, sort of mobility issues, walking, I need to make sure that I can sort of sit down and rest, and just all those things. It just makes that sort of side of parenting for me much easier.
Thank you, Natalie. And Pippa, your thoughts on the importance of accessibility information?
Yeah, I think the only other thing I could add to that, because it's already been said so beautifully, is it gives you back an element of spontaneity as well. So a big thing I'm sure any disabled person will be able to relate to is just having to do so much planning and so much faffing anytime you want to do anything ever. But the beauty of having it all at your fingertips, and the reason I use AccessAble so much now, is that if you're just out and about and you think, oh, I've got some time, I could just, goodness forbid, what a concept, just spontaneously go to a coffee shop. Having that information easily accessible, and also knowing that it's information that you can trust, because again, the other thing with sometimes somewhere will claim to be accessible, but that kind of informal consult will not have been carried out by somebody who's trained or who has lived experience of disability. So knowing that there's reliable information that you can access whenever you need it definitely allows for more spontaneity than I used to have, which is something of a game changer.
Thank you, Pippa. It's really brilliant to hear that the kind of information that we provide is so helpful to people, you know, living their day-to-day lives, getting out there, as Pippa says, being more spontaneous, having a level of assurance. So thank you. What I'd like to do next, we've had a couple of questions in the chat that I would like to cover off next, and then we will open up to Q&A. So first of all, we've had a question from John, who says that he's interested in exploring how the social model of disability fits with this very traditional approach of defining disability as something owned by the individual rather than focusing on the barriers created by society. How we address these barriers rather than what is wrong with individual disabled people. Any thoughts on that? Appreciate that. It's quite a complex question to answer. So anybody who might have any thoughts, Pippa, we'll come to you, and then Lydia next, please.
Oh, I'm going to tentatively have a go because I know that's a big question and there's so much we could dive into and we don't have a lot of time. But I am very much a supporter of the social model of disability, and I do believe that the barriers that we all face in society are the thing that poses the most significant challenges to us. But I think that something that comes quite uniquely with chronic illness is that you are dealing with a level of pain and debilitation, and I know that isn't always conducive with the social model, but it is something that a lot of us feel is relevant to talk about because it's so important in our day-to-day lives. And again, I sound like I'm properly pushing this, but the energy limiting chronic illness movement, there's a brilliant organisation called Chronic Illness Inclusion, and their work is very much focused on how we can have these conversations about the more medical, not even more medical, the kind of lived experiences of people with these chronic illnesses where your health is still, well, it's a significant challenge as it is for everybody, and how we can make that fit within the social model and still champion the social model. And I think my personal experience, my personal opinion is that there is room for both in that conversation. But I'm really looking forward to seeing how that conversation develops over the next year or so, because it feels like quite a pivotal time for it at the minute.
I would agree with that, Pippa. Thank you. Lydia, your thoughts on John's question, please.
I think to start off with, I think the one thing that, even just as a journalist, the thing that keeps coming back to me very often is the fact that a lot of the issues, it all starts with the fact that people are not being listened to. So I have been researching a story to do with the NHS, for example, and it's really striking to me how throughout all the documents and things, it always comes back to the fact that the person who within the NHS had only been listening to the parent and the carers. They hadn't actually asked the disabled person what they thought. I think that's really indicative, frankly, that in such a well-respected organisation, that attitude is just, it's very normalised. It's in terms of kind of like, I don't have a solution to this. It's an ongoing conversation, and I can only sort of really speak for myself on this. I'm not representative of all disabled people, obviously, because I'm not everyone. But I think it starts with listening, and I also think it starts with updating language. So do we all probably remember when we had them, when we had the GDPR stuff and organisations sent round the opt-in or opt-out to newsletters? I feel almost like once a year, or maybe even more often than that, there should be a refresher for organisations in terms of kind of like the language, or just even asking people what they want to be known as and how to be addressed. It's, as a personal example, I have had to make a complaint to my GP surgery today, because of the fact that even though I'm autistic, they still insist on phoning me when I have said email me. I don't do phone calls due to my disability. Yet nobody asked. It doesn't take much. It just starts with little things. We can always be learning, but it just starts with tiny gestures. Effectively, we're not expecting huge overnight change and like multi-million-pound budgets. That's silly to even suggest. It's just tiny steps.
Absolutely. I think a really good point there, Lydia, is we are all continually learning, and the idea of this session today is that it might be some of our audience's first experience of listening to people with an invisible disability, and that will help them begin their journey to better understand the needs of people with less visible and invisible conditions. Our next question has come in from Alexander, who says, do you think that some problems faced by those with hidden disability are compounded by the fact that systems available for support use a model of disability that has a very narrow definition of what it is? Pippa?
In short, yeah. I think from personal experience, and something I'm quite vocal about, is that the perception we all have of disability is this very set image of what a disabled person looks like. And in the past, that is the image that has been portrayed in the media, in day-to-day life. So I think non-disabled people at the minute have a very set image of what disability looks like. And there's a lot of work to do in exploring, again, this huge spectrum and normalizing this idea that disability has no set look. And I think it's gonna take quite a lot to start challenging that, but I do think we are beginning to see that shift. And I think if we just really can push that idea that there's no look to disability, you don't have to perceive somebody's disability with your own two eyes for it to be there, and taking people's word for it, I think that is a really important first step in beginning to tackle some of those assumptions.
Totally agree with that, Pippa, and you know, that's why we're doing this session today, and why events like this are quite so important, so that we can help people to begin that journey and begin that level of understanding. So before we open up to the rest of the audience for questions, I have one question that's come in, which says, when you have a bad experience with an organisation, do you give feedback so that they may learn from it? And if you have, what response have you received? Has anybody got an example of that they'd like to share with us? No? No examples for that one. I think I would. Oh, sorry, go on, Pippa.
Lydia's got her hand up, is what I was going to say.
Oh, I'm sorry, Lydia. I missed that. Lydia, go for it.
No worries at all. I was discussing this with somebody that I know the other day. This I find kind of problematic in the sense that it shouldn't always be incumbent on us to do the educating. That is a huge emotional labour, and I don't see why we should always have. Why should we have to deal with the cost effectively when we're just sort of going out and about? We cannot do it all the time. In terms of, as an example, I do not very often make complaints. It would have to be something very extraordinary. So the example that I gave in terms of kind of like the airport person speaking through me, for example, that's very normalized. However, if it's something more pressing, so my GP surgery not making reasonable adjustments continually, or the personal independence payment service, that was significantly escalated, because that was just sort of beyond a joke, really. It wasn't normalized, it was just out and out discriminatory. We cannot always complain about things, because inaccessibility is it's sort of like societally set. Like, it's not a standard to have, like, access to buildings and all that sort of thing.
Thank you, Lydia. Your answer really made me think about the term microaggressions and the sort of drip that we as disabled people feel when we experience the same thing happening day in, day out. And I think that, you know, it does often feel like a burden of education as a disabled person, that it is up to us to educate businesses who haven't met our needs, or organisations who haven't met our needs correctly, and that we have to carefully choose which ones we do pursue and which ones we don't, because we've all got limited energy at the end of the day. Okay, so I would like to now open up to questions from any member of our audience. If you would like to ask a question, please use the raise hand function of Teams, and we will try and fit you all in. So Gavin, I can see that you've got your hand raised. Gavin, please feel free to unmute your microphone and ask your question.
Thanks, Carrie-Anne. Thank you. This is an absolutely superb webinar. I wish I'd seen a few more of these over the last 18 months. I have a question around stats. I think a lot of people talk about over 70% of people have hidden disabilities, but something that's always been in my mind is that where somebody is maybe a wheelchair user, they might also have a hidden disability, and when somebody sees them and wants to interact with them, they just see the wheelchair or the power chair or the guide dog or the long cane, but they don't necessarily understand that that person may have an increased chance of having a hidden disability. But I haven't been able to find stats around this, people who have maybe a visible disability and a hidden disability, and I'm just wondering if the panel might have any great stats and links to those stats.
I can see Lydia's got her hand up. So Lydia, please do feel free to come in and answer Gavin's question.
Sorry, I realise I'm doing a lot of talking. In terms of comorbidities, so very often when you have an autistic person, you quite very often you have another condition such as dyspraxia and other things like that. In terms of the official statistics, there's quite a wide range in terms of the consensus. So I have seen statistics, for example, where it's like 80% of all autistic people also have XYZ. And in recent years, that's gone up to something like 95%. I don't have anything else on other conditions, though, however.
I would just like to say that, Gavin, your question really resonated with me, because and you know, people who know me may be questioning why somebody like me who is chairing this panel today, because I'm a wheelchair user, and so that part or that impairment is incredibly visible. But I do also have multiple conditions that aren't connected to my cerebral palsy necessarily, that you would not be able to see and you would not know about. And I think that's a really important point to underline, is just because you've come across somebody with a visible impairment, disability, or a visible mobility aid, it does not mean that there isn't a lot more going on under the surface that you can't see. Thank you. Any other questions for our panel? We have around 2 or 3 minutes left for questions. Hannah, I can see you've got your hand up, so please feel free to unmute your microphone and ask your question.
Hello. After all that, Caitlin, I would just like to say I also got cerebral palsy and dysphagia, which is a speech impediment, and people always automatically assume that I like to read email and text, which is harder for me as I got dyslexia. So it's actually harder for me to write an email and make a phone call. But my text and what following on from that is to a girl with autism, when she was spoke to at an airport like that, was it because he said autism, or did he say high functioning autism?
Thank you, Hannah. Lydia, I'll let you jump in and answer that if you're happy.
I like that you brought that up in terms of the high functioning thing. So my diagnosis officially on my diagnostic report is Asperger's syndrome, but I was diagnosed the month it went out of the diagnostic manual. So in terms of getting support, it has been really difficult because a lot of places have suddenly started going, that's not a real thing. We can't help you.
Yeah.
You're high functioning. When it came to the airport, in terms of this might sound potentially horrible and possibly controversial, but I've started to change the language so in order to kind of like circumvent this. So when it comes to situations, I will say, hi, I am autistic. But I think it was very much so because the fact that I can walk and talk, that is why I got the reaction. Because people seem to think they had the idea of things like Rain Man, for example. There have been occasions where people have like, oh, why aren't you like that? You can't be autistic, you're talking to me. So it is very quite common. I'd said I was autistic for that one though.
Thank you, Lydia.
Because I noted that people have stopped reading the term at verdicts now because of something about who discovered it was a Nazi, so it was deemed to be unthing. And I'm just thinking, how do you differentiate between that side of the spectrum and that side of the spectrum?
I feel like that's another conversation for another time, because that has a huge amount of nuance that's needed to that conversation. You can, I'm on Twitter and all that sort of thing, so if you want to find me, I'm very happy to continue with chatting about that, just because that is a huge answer and I don't think I can do it in 30 seconds.
Thank you, Lydia. I would agree with that. It's quite a complex topic to unpick. I also will be leaving my contact details at the end of the presentation. So for anybody who feels like they've had a question or a comment or a topic that they'd like to explore that hasn't been covered today, do please feel free to get in touch with me directly. I can also field any inquiries that you might have for our panelists today. So that's it for questions. We're out of time for questions, I'm afraid. I do just want to thank all of our participants for sharing their really valuable thoughts and experiences today. We can't thank you enough for your time and your insight and expertise. And we hope, to our audience, we hope that the session has given you some valuable insight into hidden disability. We will be sending an email around over the next few days to everyone who's attended today with a recording of the session, which you are free to share. So feel free to share that with any networks or colleagues who haven't been able to attend today. The email will also include a short feedback form, which we'd be so grateful if you could complete, because it really helps us to think about planning future sessions like this. Thank you all for joining us. I will just move on to the next slide with my contact details. So feel free to grab my contact details from that slide and to get in touch with me if you have anything that hasn't been addressed today, any comments, feedback for our participants, or if you'd like to be connected with participants directly. Thank you, everyone.